Hello everybody and welcome to another video. Today we are going to be reviewing the album Vessels by the band Starset. Now for those of you who don't know, Starset is one of my favorite rock bands. I got into them, I'd say last spring or last summer, shortly after this album came out at least. I've been a pretty big fan of them ever since. I really like their sound and their style, and I just think generally that they're a really good band. And seeing as how Vessels 2.0, which is pretty much Vessels the Deluxe Edition, came out pretty recently, I figured I would review the album as well as the bonus stuff that comes with Vessels 2.0. So as usual, I'm going to start out with the good things about this album, which I think there's quite a few. Of course, as I usually point out, the production in this album is pretty good. Some people might say it's a little overproduced, but I think that the style of production in this album fits their style very well, since they are kind of a space sci-fi sort of themed band, I guess. So having this kind of sound and this kind of production and everything, I think it just wouldn't fit quite as well if it was done differently. But generally everything sounds really good. It's enjoyable to listen to from just a production standpoint. Another thing is that this album, in my opinion, has some of the best songs from Starset overall. Granted, they only have 2 albums, but this still, I think, has easily some of their best songs, like Ricochet, Die For You, Unbecoming, Everglow, Satellite, and Monster. And most of those songs, I would say, are better than the best songs on Transmissions, like Halo, My Demons, and Dark On Me. And overall, the song quality throughout the album is pretty good. You do get a couple of songs that are not as good, which I'll talk about later when I go on to some of the negative things. But for the most part, the album is pretty good, and the songs are generally very well done. I also enjoy the vocals on this album. I think Dustin Bates is a pretty decent vocalist, and I think he fits well with Starset's style. On Transmissions, he did mostly singing. He did a little bit of screaming here and there, but it was pretty much like 99% singing as far as I remember. Whereas there's a little more variety on this album. He does a little more screaming on this album, and some of his singing has kind of a rougher sound to it on songs like Gravity of You, Bringing It Down, and Frequency, where he just kind of has this rougher sound to his voice that I think really accents the darker atmosphere of this album, because that is another thing I like, because I think this album feels and sounds darker than Transmissions did, and I think some bands' best albums are the ones where they kind of go a little darker. You know, when I think of Red, Innocence and Instinct, and of Beauty and Rage, stuff like that, where they just kind of explore darker themes and have a darker overall sound, I guess, if that makes sense. And I think that the vocals that he uses throughout the album that are a little rougher and stuff like that really accent that. The lyrics on this album are also pretty good. I really like, as I said, they are kind of a space sci-fi kind of themed band a little bit. They don't really talk about those kinds of things, but they typically talk about just kind of love and life and things like that. I think their lyrics lend themselves very well to those topics, because they're able to kind of use the kind of terminology of like sci-fi and space and stuff and apply it to that, which I think is really cool. It kind of brings everything together. So, of course, with them having that theme to them, it fits for them to have those kinds of lyrics. And I just think overall the lyrics fit the album very well, and they themselves are pretty well written, I think, for the most part. And I also said that this album is darker than Transmissions. I would also say it's heavier than Transmissions. Transmissions, to me, is a good album. I will say it's a very good album, but it is much more of a just straight rock album. There's not really much variety when it comes to that. This album has some of that. It brings in some heavier elements. The guitars it seems like they're a little lower tuned. I'm not sure if they are or not. Not necessarily saying that equals more heavy, but it does help in this case. and kind of using a more gent kind of style to them at some points, which I do enjoy. Generally, it just feels heavier and darker than Transmissions did, which I think is definitely a good thing. Now, one thing I've seen some people complain about with this band and several others is the electronics and the synths that are used throughout. Personally, I don't mind if they're used as long as they're used well, and I think in this album they're used very well, and I would say that they are used better than in Transmissions, because to me, the synths in Transmissions were still good and they still fit, but they weren't integrated into the music quite as well as they are on this album. They kind of stuck out a little bit more, and not in a necessarily really good way, although they were still well done in Transmissions. They just kind of, in some songs at some points, felt a little bit like they didn't completely mesh together with the rest of the music as well, whereas I think in this album, that is done much better. And overall, this album I think is pretty good beginning to end. Has really great songs spread all throughout the album, and I just really like it. However, I do have a couple of problems with this album. Granted, there is a lot more good than bad in my opinion. Of course, not everything on this album is going to be great. I do have a couple of problems with it. So one of those being that a couple of the songs on here are kind of mediocre. While most of the album is pretty good, there's a couple songs that I'm just not a huge fan of. For example, Into the Unknown is one of my least favorites, and that reminds me a lot of some of my least favorite songs from Transmissions, like Point of No Return, It Has Begun, and Rise to Fall. It just reminds me a lot of those songs, has a kind of similar sound and style to them in some ways. And generally I'm just not a huge fan of it. And then also the song Telepathic, which in itself is not a terrible song. I do see some good qualities in it. I think kind of the melodies of it and everything is done pretty well, and it does a good job to split up the album, or give a little more variety to the album, because you don't really see that many songs of this style on there. Maybe Starlight kind of fits a little bit more with Telepathic, but it does a good job at adding variety to the album. But it's still not a song that I go back to all that much. It is probably the most electronic focused song on the album, probably the most pop focused song on the album. Granted, not many songs on this album sound like pop music, but this one I would not be surprised if I heard it on like a pop radio station or something. So it's not a terrible song. I think there are good things about it, but it's not really for me. And the other thing is that while the album is good throughout, I do think it's a little long. Maybe if they took out one or two songs, some of the weaker songs, like I said, Into the Unknown. And I don't know about Telepathic because, like I said, I think that does a good job at adding variety. So maybe take out one of the other weaker songs on the album or something like that, just to give it a little bit less length, because this is like an hour and 10 minutes long or something, which I think an hour long for an album is kind of pushing it. There are some really great albums that are fairly long like that, but I think as far as the listener's attention span, that's kind of pushing it a little bit. Having an album that's 10 minutes longer than that is not a great idea, I think, so I think they could have trimmed things down at least a little. But overall, I think that the album in general is really good, and I really enjoy it. Much more good than bad, in my opinion. And so since Vessels 2.0 came out recently, I figured I would talk a little bit about that, because that's kind of what made me interested in doing a video reviewing this album. So I'm going to talk about stuff on the Vessels 2.0 now. Overall, it's mostly acoustic versions that got added, and I think there's some really good ones, like the acoustic versions for Die For You, Starlight, and Ricochet. I really enjoy those three acoustic versions. It's hard for me to say for Ricochet because I really, really love Ricochet, but I think for Die For You and Starlight, the acoustic versions are at least almost as good as the original songs. I think they did very well with those, and I really enjoy them. And then they also included a kind of somewhat changed version of Bringing It Down, which is Bringing It Down 2.0. When I first heard this song, I thought they were going to be redoing the entire album like this, which I guess would have been kind of cool because the song does have more of a symphonic element to it. Removes like the auto-tune from Dustin Bates' voice, and gives it an overall more of that kind of style rather than Starset's very electronic focused, kind of more of that kind of style. But it turns out this is the only song they did it to. And I will be honest, Bringing It Down is one of my least favorite songs on Vessels. I've just never really gotten that into it. But the 2.0 version is pretty good still. It's kind of interesting because it does make things a little bit different. I would say I still prefer the original version for reasons that I'll get into in a minute. I do think that it was kind of an interesting choice for them to change up the song and do something a little bit different with it. Now, I'm afraid there's not a whole lot more positive I have to say about Vessels 2.0. First of all, the remixes are okay. I'm not really that into remixes. I think I've barely even listened to them actually. And from what I did hear of them, they were okay, but nothing that spectacular. My biggest problem with the 2.0 version is that there are absolutely no new original songs. Typically, if a band releases a deluxe edition, sometimes at least, there's at least one original song in there, at least from some of the deluxe editions that I've seen. But there is nothing new here aside from the acoustics and the remixes, which are of songs that are already on the album. And I would have liked to see at least one original song on here. It doesn't have that, so it's not really worth it quite as much to me. They also included a cover. Instead of an original song, they included a cover, which I guess is fine. I would rather have a cover on a deluxe edition as a bonus track rather than on the standard edition of an album. But they did a cover of Love You to Death, and I can't remember who did the original version. They did a cover of that song on Vessels 2.0, and while it's okay, I would still say it's probably one of my least favorites. It doesn't really fit their style quite as well, I think. Generally is not as good as their original stuff. And about the acoustics, like I said, they're good. I think several of them are very good, actually. But a few of them are not nearly as good as the original versions, like the acoustic version for Satellite, for example. I just really don't care for that too much. And also with the acoustic versions, I don't know if it's all of them, I can't remember, but I know that at least some of them include drums. And I don't mind that, but I think it would have worked better if it was no drums at all. Or at least they were given a little bit less of a presence or something like that. Just somehow about the way they're integrated doesn't quite sound right to me, and I'm not sure what it is, but I don't really care too much for the drums. And as I said about Bringing It Down 2.0, while it is an interesting take on the song, I don't think that it fits their sound and their style as well as the original song does. Like I said, it adds more of a symphonic element to it, which is fine, but then it also removes the auto-tune, and it seems to me changed around some other things that I think are central to their style and essential for their style. And while it's still a good song by itself, I don't think it fits their sound as well as the original version does. And I also feel like just with the added symphonic element and the way the sound of the song is overall, Starset has collaborated with Red in the past. Dustin Bates co-wrote a few of the songs on Gone. I feel like this song is trying too hard to be kind of like Red in some way. I don't know if that was their intent, but it just feels that way. But overall, that's pretty much everything I have to say. I will say I was pretty disappointed with Vessels 2.0. Having the new acoustic versions was a nice touch, and I always appreciate getting stuff like that kind of changes up the original versions and does something different. And they are generally pretty good. But overall, as far as the cover and not having any original songs and stuff like that, I will say I was kind of disappointed. But the album itself is really good, and I do really enjoy it. I definitely recommend it, and generally, I just think it's a really fantastic album. As far as my 3 favorite songs from this, I had a little bit of a hard time with it, just because I could easily list like 5 songs. But I went with Ricochet, which is probably my favorite Starset song in general, Die For You, and Monster, with special shout-outs to Unbecoming and Satellite. So that pretty much wraps up this review. Let me know what you guys think. Do you agree with me or disagree with me or anything? What did you think of Vessels 2.0? Did it disappoint you, or were you happy with it? And so on. let me know in the comments, and that's pretty much everything I have for this video, so I will see you guys next time.